So tonight, I want to begin by inviting your attention to an Old Testament passage that will kind of set the stage for what is the theme of what we have to say for tonight. Moses was telling the children of Israel that you shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your brethren you shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Now, he's speaking, of course, in way down the line, down in the future, when the children of Israel, centuries later, would demand a king. Then a little later in verse 18, also it shall be when he, that king, sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book from the one before the priests, the Levites. What I want to notice with you tonight is the statement that he will write for himself a copy of the law of Moses. This very statement indicates that even in the Old Testament times, there was the necessity for the copying of the Word of God. There were no printing presses and there were no printers or computers, obviously. And so the only way that a person could obtain a copy of the Scripture would be to have someone give them one that had already been copied, or copy it themselves, and in this case, the king was to make a copy. So tonight, we're concerned about the copies of the Scriptures, the copies of the Bible that were made a long, long time ago, long before the printing press, which are the basis for our Bible today. Tonight, what we're going to call your attention to is the question, where does the Greek New Testament come from? I know that some of the teachers and some of the brethren here have a copy of the Greek New Testament at home on your shelf somewhere. You may never look at it, or you may look at it frequently if you have an interlinear Greek-English translation or whatever. But when I'm asking, where does the Greek New Testament come from, I'm not saying, well, where did you buy that thing? Or where did the printer get it? But instead, I'm asking a more fundamental question about where the very thing itself comes from. How do the printers know what to print? And where did they get what to print? I like timelines, as you know by now. So I'm going to put another timeline up here. Now, over here on the far left, long ago in the first century, the New Testament was written in Greek. And today, in the 21st century, we read our English translation of the Bible. We also know that not too long ago, the New Testament was translated from Greek into English. And most familiarly, this is the King James translation that was done around the year 1611. And then after that, we have sort of a general idea, I think, of our Bible and sort of the background of it. But it's this period in here between the time of the first century and when the New Testament was first translated into English, such as with Tyndale or with the King James Bible. There's about 16 centuries in there that I think maybe that a lot of our knowledge about that background is rather sketchy. And so tonight, what I want to do is spend some time to fill in this gap. And filling in this gap will help us with a couple of things. Number one, it will help, as the screen indicates there, to understand the translation issue. But it also, I think, will bolster our confidence in that book that we hold in our hands, the Bible, and give us, may I say, some ammunition, if I may say, to confront those who tell us that the Bible is untethered from anything that is really substantial and that it's just sort of hanging out there in thin air. So tonight, a brief history of the Greek New Testament. Now, I got a lot of material here. I condensed this from a couple of sessions, and so this is going to be rapid fire. So I'm going to give a lot of information. I don't expect that people are going to remember every detail. I just want to put it out there and give us a quick view and leave us with a general impression so as to fill in a mental picture that maybe we don't presently have at the beginning of this lesson. Okay, so we want to start where the passage I read a while ago, where the king had to copy out by hand a copy of the law. That was in the Old Testament. We're not going to worry about the Old Testament so much tonight. We're more interested in the New Testament. And we're going to begin where the New Testament began, with handwritten copies. I read this passage on the Lord's Day morning, Colossians chapter 4 and verse 16. The Apostle Paul wrote to the church at Colossae and said, "Now, When this epistle is read among you, see that it is read also in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you likewise read the epistle from Laodicea. We understand, of course, that there was a letter written to Colossae, which we do have in our New Testament, and a letter written to the city and the church in Laodicea, a letter which we do not have, and Paul says they were to exchange these. Now, I don't think that the church at Colossae just gave up their letter and sent it off to Laodicea, and Laodicea vice versa. I don't think that's what happened. All the evidence that we have now indicates that a process something like this is probably what took place. Colossae copied their letter. Laodicea copied the letter that Paul had sent to them. Colossae kept their copy and kept the original and sent the copy to Laodicea, and likewise so did the church at Laodicea. And consequently, we know that some kind of process like this was in fact done from very, very early, because we have thousands of copies of the New Testament books still in existence today that were copied, and it's pretty easy to tell generally kind of when and what century those copies were made. So it's been done down through the centuries. So, from the originals to the printing press, and by the originals I mean the piece of papyrus and the stylus that Paul, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, one of those 8 or 9 writers of the New Testament, held in their hand and fired off to their destination. That first draft, that first writing. So we're dealing now in this first section with handwritten copies from the 1st to the 15th centuries. And the reason we go to the 15th century is because in 1439 was the invention of the printing press, the 15th century. And after that, well, some decades after that, the New Testament began to be printed in a printing press and not copied by hand anymore. Okay, so let's use the book of Romans for an example. Let's say that the Apostle Paul wrote the book of Romans, and we're going to let that little diamond there represent the piece of papyrus that the Apostle Paul wrote those 16 chapters on. Somewhere along the line, someone made a copy of that, and someone else made another copy. And it probably wasn't quite as clean as my diagram indicates, but other copies were made from those copies, and maybe more from the original, and more copies were made down the line somewhere. We don't know exactly, but this has to be the way it happened. Then, after a little passing of time, then the original that Paul wrote disappeared. We don't know where it's at. Maybe it was destroyed, maybe it was worn out, maybe it got lost in a fire, maybe it was washed downstream during a flood. We don't know what happened to that original, very papyrus that Paul wrote on and held in his hand. But the copies remained, and more copies were made. Now, with the passing of time then, more and more copies were made, but at the same time, some of those copies were disappearing because of use, because they were worn out, because they were lost, maybe because they were confiscated by the government in maybe the 4th century. Anyway, many copies that were in existence at one time no longer exist. All right? So, what you're looking at here is my attempt to make a graphic representation of the hand copying process that took place and the subsequent loss of some of those copies, and how that this process was repeated for all 27 books for about 15 centuries. So let's go back here now and start with all 27 books. Now, in the 1st century, the books were written. By the 2nd century, copies were made. Now, those little white dots represent copies, and don't count them. That's not intended to represent any particular number. It's just to give us an impression that in the 2nd century, copies were made, and then in the 3rd century, copies were made. And along about this time, maybe sooner, maybe later, again, all the originals that are called autographs, the ones that the New Testament writers actually wrote on with their own hand, those books disappeared. And what remains are copies, and those originals are called the autographs. They're lost. Now, there could be that maybe some of those early papyri manuscripts might be one of the apostles' copies, but there's no way to prove that. And it's probably a good thing, because if it were provable, then people would probably worship it, and that would not be right at all, of course. So, centuries went by, and more copies were made as each subsequent century passed, and as more and more copies were made of more and more copies, then the number of total copies was probably on the increase for a long, long time. Now, what you're looking at here then is a representation of what it might have been like to count up all the copies that were ever made. But the truth is that not only are the autographs lost, but look at the white dots, watch, some of them go away because some of them, many of them, have been lost. It is estimated, in fact, that there are only about 10% of all the copies that ever existed that still survive today. And notice also, just as for a future reference down the line in our lesson, that the majority of these manuscripts fall in the latter centuries, as you can see in that orange half circle there that I've put on the screen for you. The majority of the manuscripts are from late centuries, but there are also manuscripts, handwritten copies from earlier centuries. So that means then today there still exists about 5,700 manuscripts or so, complete and partial, of the New Testament. Now, at the time that the printing press was invented, all of these were not known. Today, they're all cataloged because we've had 500 years of people chasing after these things and cataloging them. But when the printing press was invented, it was not possible to know that. It'd be like trying to figure out how many copies of the New King James Version there are in Fresno, California. How would you know? Well, you can't know because no one has account of that. But with the passing of centuries, although all of these manuscripts were not known in the 15th century when printing was invented, gradually these copies have come to be known in the following century. So I repeat, today we know of about 5,700 or more copies. Now, all of these are hand-copied copies. That's important to keep in mind. And when they are hand-copied, that means no two of them are exactly the same. Now, you and I are accustomed to having our Bibles be uniformly printed, and you pick up one copy and it looks exactly the same, and every word is spelled the same in another copy of the same translation. But in the handwritten versions, it's not that way, and it's not possible because the human being cannot make copies, perfect copies. Try it sometime. Get the book of John or the book of Revelation and sit down and decide, okay, I'm going to copy out this whole thing. And then when you get done, you give it to someone and you give them the book that you copied from and you ask them to find some mistakes. And you know, without even trying this, that there's going to be mistakes in there. Okay? So these mistakes must be sifted out. And this is done through a process of pulling these manuscripts together and comparing them. And those who do this, the nerds who do this kind of work, are the people that are called textual critics. Doesn't mean they're critical of the Bible. It means that they're the ones who sift through and determine where these variants are in order to weed out the mistakes. And of course, we want to know what the apostles wrote. And so textual criticism for that reason is important. So I've tried to give you what I see to be a general picture of kind of what the situation was up to the invention of the printing press. But now I introduce you to Johannes Gutenberg, who was born in 1400, died in 1468, and invented the printing press in 1439. This was revolutionary. Those of you who remember the internet coming into being in the 1990s can remember what a transformation that was just within our lifetime. Well, the invention of the printing press was no less a revolution than was the invention of the internet. So we need to start with the printing press now and move forward. From the printing press to the King James Version. We're going to bite this off in chunks. So let's start with the first chunk. First of all, to get the Bible, the New Testament, Greek New Testament, in the printing press, we have to start in Basel, Switzerland. And in Basel, Switzerland, there was a man by the name of Desiderius Erasmus, who in 1466 was born and died in 1536. And in the year 1515, 96 years before the King James Bible, and 11 years before Tyndale translated the English Bible from the Greek New Testament, Desiderius Erasmus met with Johann Froben in Basel, Switzerland, and these two fellows got together. Froben was a printer, and Desiderius Erasmus was a scholar. These two fellows got together and said, we need to put the Greek New Testament on the printing press. They've already been printing the Latin Bible for nearly 100 years now. We want to get the original into print. And so that's what they did. They came together and they were the first to print and publish the Greek New Testament in the year 1516. Okay, now how did they do this? Really, it was Erasmus who did it, who prepared it, and then Froben was the printer. So how did Erasmus make his Greek New Testament? Well, basically, here's our chart again, showing the centuries and the respective manuscripts along the way. And what he did was he managed to locate 7 late Greek manuscripts. They weren't that easy to find in that part of the world at that time. To find Greek manuscripts, you really needed to go over to the Byzantine Empire, but these fellows were in the West, what is Europe today. And so Latin was the Bible that was everywhere. And so it was not that easy to find copies of the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, but he found 7 of them, and I put a little circle there just to represent a small number, like the number 7 of manuscripts, and they're down in those later centuries, 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. Okay? So this selection that he made, like I said, is purely coincidental because it just happened to be the ones that he could find. So let me show you a chart. On the left is the first edition. That's what I'm talking about here, of Erasmus's Greek New Testament. The year was 1516, and then in the little, the big part of the chart, I put the manuscripts that are here. Now, what you're looking at here, if I can point this out very quickly here, is that these numbers out here to the left are what the manuscripts were numbered or how they were cataloged way back then. The century is the century in which they were copied. So 12th, 12th, 15th, 12th, 11th, and 15th, really those manuscripts were not really that old when Erasmus collected them. And then over here is what is contained in those manuscripts, so that not each one of them had the whole New Testament, but each manuscript had different parts of the New Testament, as you can see here. And then these numbers are the modern cataloging numbers, and I don't know why I didn't get the other ones, but I didn't. So anyway, so what you're looking at here is the manuscript collection that Erasmus used to bring together the Greek New Testament. And so what you're looking at here these were the manuscripts that he used to collate and make the Gospels part of his printed Greek Testament. These are the ones that were used in Acts. These are those that were used for the letters of the New Testament, and he only had 1 manuscript for the book of Revelation. And so this was it. This was what he used to make his Greek New Testament. Here's a picture of it right here. You got 2 columns. The column on the left is the Greek New Testament, and the column on the right is the translation, the Latin translation that Erasmus made. Now, Erasmus, after he printed and published this thing, he said that this thing was thrown together rather than edited, which is just another way of saying that we worked on it hurriedly. We know we made mistakes. We know later editions are going to have to be made to weed out those mistakes and get the thing improved, but we wanted to be the first. You know, when you're the first to do something, you're immortal in a sense. And not only that, but they made a nice little bit of money off of this, I suppose, because I think the number is they sold 3,000 copies early on after its printing. Now, that doesn't sound like much by today's sales standards, but back then it was a lot of books, especially when it was Greek, which a lot of people did not read in the western part of the world at that time. Okay, so here's our timeline. Let's go through this quickly now. We've put Erasmus's first edition into print in 1516. Then, as a few years passed, he issued more editions in which he made changes and made corrections, spelling errors, or maybe he brought in other manuscripts and saw that, well, really the wording here should be this or should be that or whatever. Then he died. And then after that, another man came along and did the same thing, Stephanus, who basically took what Erasmus had done and continued that work down the line, and he issued some later editions. And this 1550 edition is really significant because in 1550 he issued a Greek Testament in which he not only put the text of the Greek manuscripts or the text of the Greek scripture, but also out in the margin, there's a picture of it right there from the book of Matthew. I think it's Matthew. Yes, Matthew. And this little column out here on the side is where he put variants. He said, okay, I put the text in the middle here, but out here in the margin I'm going to show you that there are little variations in manuscripts, and here's the wording of them so that you'll have that information in my edition of the Greek text. So that's what Stephanus was the first to do this, and you're looking at a picture of the first page in the screen here. Okay, so Stephanus did all this, and then he died. And then another fellow came along by the name of Theodore Beza and did the same thing. And he issued all these copies and did the same work, basically continuing to work at perfecting this text as best they could with the information that they had. Now, all these years, Theodore Beza published a different edition, a new edition of the Greek text. But look there, the year 1604. Now, those of you who have been here this week, you may think, oh, that rings a bell. I remember the other night when we were talking about the King James Bible, and David said that whenever Elizabeth died, Queen Elizabeth of England, the first, died in 1603, then King James VI of Scotland became King James of England. And it was a year after that, 1604, that King James called the Hampton Court Conference. Remember that? And right after that, they decided, or during that conference, they decided they were going to make a new translation. And that was the King James Bible that we call it today. Now, what do you think they used to make that translation of the New Testament? Where did they get their Greek Testament to make that translation? Well, I'll tell you where they got it. They looked at Erasmus's editions. They looked at Stephanus's 1550 edition, and they also used Theodore Beza's 1598 edition. These are the editions that he used. Now, you know what, friends? The amazing thing about the internet, like I said, it's revolutionary. You can go to archive.com today and look at those very books, or at least copies of them, printed copies of them, that the King James translators used. I'm going to show you one here in just a moment. So when the King James Version was issued, this title page appeared with Moses on the left and Aaron on the right. And in the middle there it says, the Holy Bible containing the Old and the New. I'm using the original spelling and punctuation here, by the way. The Holy Bible containing the Old and the New, newly translated out of the original tongues, using Erasmus, using Stephanus, and using Beza, and with the former translations diligently compared and revised. You remember those translations we went over the other night were translations such as Tyndale and Whitchurch and the Geneva Bible and the Bishop's Bible and Matthew's Bible and Coverdale's Bible and those Bibles, you know. And so they used the English translations and they used those specific Greek texts that we're looking at. Now, we also pointed out that there were 3 translation committees in 3 different colleges at that time, and we're going to look at the 2 that were at Oxford who translated Matthew. When they translated Matthew, here is a picture of the very document that they would have used. Not the very copy of it, but it would have, since it was done on the printing press, it looked identical. It looked like what you're looking at there. And when they used Beza as a comparison, they also used something that looked just like that right there. And I pulled those right off of archive.com. It's amazing what you can do today. Well, all right, so that brings us up to the King James Bible. Now, between 1516 and 1604, a total of 25 manuscripts were brought together. We started out with 7, you remember, in 1515 when Erasmus first started putting his Greek text together. Now we're up to 25. Now that doesn't seem like a lot to accomplish in nearly a century, but by this point in time, this is about where they are. So now what we want to do is begin from the King James translation and up to the modern translations. And here we want to introduce a little turn in the road. And that is that the printed Greek New Testament gets a name, a popular name that they began to call it. And this happened, here's our time frame again, and I put the Elzevers up here. The Elzevers, I believe, were an uncle and his nephew, and they owned a print shop. And like everybody, who has a business, you're looking for opportunities to turn some revenue, and that's what they were doing, and they were printers, and they saw after this over a century of printing the Greek New Testament was a pretty good deal. So they decided that they were going to make one, and so they made 3 that I'm aware of, one in 1624, 1633, and one in 1641. Now, I said the New Testament gets a name. This printed Greek New Testament gets a name. And it happened in the 1633 edition. This is just a little side road here, but it's significant. It's huge because the name that it gets sticks and still is used today. We have to go to Leyden, Holland, and in 1633, when the Elsevier brothers published their edition of the Greek New Testament, they put this thing in there, which is in Latin, of course, and back then, a whole lot more people read Latin than do today, but this says, "You hold in your hand the text received by all, in which we give nothing changed or corrupted." Now the key words here are those 2 right there in orange, textum receptum. And textum receptum in English translates as the text received. And so they started calling this thing the Textus Receptus, or in English, the received text. And a lot of times today, in our modern age of shortcuts, we like to abbreviate it and just call it the TR. The TR stands for the Textus Receptus. So in 1633 there, when the Elsevier brothers made their edition of the Greek New Testament, they had the phrase textum receptum, and that name stuck. And from then on, all of those versions that you see up there, or those editions up there, and all these down here, took that name by default. That's just what people started calling it. Not only these, but all later editions came collectively to be called the Textus Receptus, or the received text, or the TR. Okay? So that's huge. And I know it's maybe obscure information, but as we get down the stream of time and come to our present day, and the whole translation issue, or maybe even translation controversy, is absolutely rooted in this very document that I've been describing. So, back to Erasmus. In 1516, he had 7 or so manuscripts, and by a century and a half after 1516, I'm going to make that circle over there a little bit bigger just to represent that more manuscripts were brought into consideration with that text called the Textus Receptus. As more and more editions were printed, they were consulting more and more newly discovered manuscripts to issue the editions of that book. Now, the Textus Receptus was the Greek New Testament, the accepted Greek New Testament, for 365 years, from 1516 to 1881. Now, those of you who have been here this week, do you remember what happened in 1881? In 1881, you may remember the British issued the British Revised Version. It's called the Revised Version. In 1885 is when it was actually issued. But they started working on it earlier than that. So we'll come back to that, but that's huge. The publication of the Revised Version in 1885 marked the end, really, of the supremacy of the Textus Receptus. And we'll talk about that as we go. Well, after this time then, on into the 17th through the 19th centuries, there are more manuscript discoveries and more printed editions that are made, all basically a reworking of the TR, of the Textus Receptus. Okay, we start with the King James Version. The Elseviers in 1633, we've already pointed that out, published theirs, and now we move on from here. A man by the name of Brian Walton issued another issue in 1655 to 57. He had about 30 manuscripts by that time. Then in 1675 came John Fell. And then in 1707 came John Mill. And by this time, this is over 100 years now, or nearly 100 years after the printing of the King James Bible, they have about 82 manuscripts that come into play. Now what John Mill did, though, was he took all of those manuscripts, and you talk about a job now, you talk about tedium, you talk about having... giving yourself a headache. He went through every one of these and marked out every single difference between them, and he found 30,000 differences. Now, as soon as I say that, that makes people very nervous. But the point is not to make people nervous. Let me say, I have more confidence in the reliability of the Bible today than I did when I was 25. And I had a lot of confidence then, but I have much more now. So I'm not trying to erode anyone's confidence here. What we're going to do as we go along is we're going to see that really this is a positive thing, as we'll illustrate. So the vast majority, first of all, of such variants as I've just introduced to this discussion tonight is spelling errors. And a lot of times it's not even errors. It just depends on what part of the empire the copyist was copying in. For example, in Britain, they spell labor with a U. In the United States, we spell it without a U. Some people spell the name Griffin, I-N on the end. Some people spell the name Griffin with an E-N. And if you look into Greek mythology, you're going to see Griffin spelled with a Y-P-H-O-N. Now, just for the record, the F-I-N is the correct one. But then the name of John looks like this in the Greek New Testament, Ioannis. And those two things there that look like a V are actually an N sound. In some manuscripts, they've got two of them, and some manuscripts, they've got only one of them. And in some manuscripts, it's spelled both ways. Every one of those is counted among the number of variants. Well, I wish I could spend more time talking about this, but I must go on for the sake of time. But I want to emphasize that the variants are actually a good thing, as I'll get to here in just a moment. Okay, so now, next of all, was Edward Wells, who published an edition in 1709 to 19, then another man by the name of Richard Bentley in 1720. Now, Bentley did make, by the way, speaking of variants, he made a wonderful statement about the variants. He said, if there had been but one manuscript of the Greek New Testament, then we would have no variant readings at all. In other words, if all we possessed, if all that came down to us through all the centuries was one copy of the New Testament, and all the others got lost, burned up, washed away in a flood or whatever, and we only had one copy left, you know what? There wouldn't be any variants. There wouldn't be one single variant because there's only one copy of the whole thing. But you know what? There would be no way for us to know if that copy was accurate. There'd be no way. Because it may come from several centuries after the time of the apostles, and all the copies before it are gone, and all the copies after it are gone, and we wouldn't know what is actually the words of the original writers. But he goes on. But would the text be in a better condition in that case than it is now that we have 30,000 variants? And the answer is no, the text would not be better off because we would have no way of, like I said, knowing if that single copy was correct. So he goes on. It is good, therefore, to have more anchors than one, meaning it's good to have more than one manuscript, and another manuscript to join the first one would give more authority as well as more security. In other words, the more manuscripts you have, although it's going to result, since they're hand copies and everybody makes mistakes when they write, the more copies you have, it's better, even though you get more variants with more copies, because not every manuscript makes the same mistake in the same place. So you can use the host of manuscripts to compare the differences and find out what the original is. So even though more manuscripts bring more variants, more manuscripts also bring more security for an accurate New Testament. And that was what Bentley was arguing. Okay, now there was another young fellow who came along by the name of Johann Albrecht Bengel. And Johann Albrecht Bengel had at his disposal in his lifetime 94 manuscripts. And at this time, Johann Albrecht Bengel was a young fellow, early 20s. And he was a theology student at Tübingen when John Mill, in 1707, up there to the left at the bottom there, published those 30,000 variants. And Johann Albrecht Bengel was a very conscientious Bible student. He loved the Bible. He was very, very conscientious and very disturbed by those 30,000 variants that were published by John Mill. So young Johann Albrecht Bengel devoted the rest of his life to the study of the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, and he published that he came to see that there was great validity to what John Mill had done in publishing these variants, because when he published them, it was very controversial. People thought that he was tearing down the Bible, when in fact Bengel came along and said, well, look, I believe in the Bible as much as or more than you do, and I am convinced by the argument that we compare the manuscripts to weed out the variants, and the more manuscripts we have, the more variants we have, but the more variants and more manuscripts we have, the more we're able to compare and contrast and arrive at the solid conclusion of the wording of the original text. This is just what has come down to us through the providence of God and through history. And now we are able to deal with those matters. Okay, so Bengel was upset about the 30,000 variants, but he came to realize that the statement of Bentley about the goodness of having so many copies was a good thing. Well, next, Johann Jakob Wettstein, 1752, had 125 manuscripts when he published his edition of the Textus Receptus. And then later on, Johann Jakob Griesbach in 1775. Now, by the time of Griesbach, 1775, that's the time of the American Revolution. And by this point in time, they've accumulated enough of these manuscripts, and enough people, scholars and students, have been comparing these manuscripts now that they begin to see that there are characteristic groupings. You can take this group of manuscripts, and they sort of have this characteristic group of differences and variants, and over here is another group of manuscripts. They have this characteristic grouping of variants, and they began to separate these off into what has come to be called text families. And these text families then can be identified with certain geographical regions. And so you have manuscripts that belong in the Western tradition, manuscripts that belong in the Byzantine tradition, and manuscripts that belong and are from the Alexandrian tradition from down in Alexandria, Egypt. Incidentally, the green up there, the Byzantine, is the vast majority of the manuscripts. And incidentally, it is that same region from which the manuscripts that formulated the Textus Receptus came about. I'm hurrying. I know I'm giving you tons of information. We must hasten. The modern period, the 19th to the 21st century, in which there was an explosion of manuscript discovery. In the 19th century, archaeology was invented. In the 19th century, people were going all over the world digging up old places in Greece and Rome and in the Holy Land. And we have so much information today that was not known before that because of that. And one of the impetuses, it's not the right way, but the way to say it is to say that one great impetus in all of this was the discovery of many manuscripts. So Schultz published an edition in 1836. He had 616 manuscripts. Now, after him comes a very important figure, Konstantin von Tischendorf. And in 1859, he published an edition of the Greek New Testament on the basis of an amazing discovery that he made. His full name was Lobegat Friedrich Konstantin von Tischendorf. And I think you know that if there are any young parents out there looking for names for their bouncing baby boy, here's some possibilities for you. But he was born in 1815, died in 1874. He's been called the 19th century Indiana Jones. And that's not just a title. In fact, this is the man, the real human being, that the character Indiana Jones was modeled off of. He was the inspiration for Indiana Jones. The difference between this man and Harrison Ford is that Tischendorf was the real thing. So Tischendorf goes all over the world. He's famous, most famous, for discovering Codex Sinaiticus. Codex is the Latin word for book. Sinaiticus means that's where he found it. He found a book in Mount Sinai, of all places, in the most remote desert that you can possibly imagine, and recovered a manuscript there that was at that time the oldest known copy of the whole Bible known to exist. And from that manuscript, he produced a text that leaned heavily on that manuscript. Well, and it varied from the TR as a result. Here's a picture of it. This is the end of Romans and the beginning of 1 Corinthians, and this manuscript was copied by hand in the middle of the 4th century. Scholars usually date it somewhere between 325 and 375. Well, when Tischendorf found this manuscript, it rocked the world. If you can imagine, it rocked the world. And what he did influenced a couple of other fellows later in the century. Notice the year, 1881. In 1881, B.F. Westcott and F.J.A. Hort published a Greek text that did not conform to the Textus Receptus. It was a manuscript, it was a printing of the Greek Testament that did not rely on those same manuscripts that the received text had relied on, but which the King James was translated on, and incidentally, the New King James was translated on. But this new Greek text published by Westcott and Hort took into account older manuscripts that had been discovered through time, and in particular that of Tischendorf's Codex Sinaiticus. And so the revised version of 1881 was based on that text, and Codex Sinaiticus was part of it. Okay, so I'm trying to hurry. I know this is a lot of information. We move on. F.H.A. Scrivener in 1894 had 3,000 manuscripts at his disposal by that time in the late 1800s. Then Eberhard Nestle in 1898 did what was really so ingeniously simple that it also rocked the world. What he did, Eberhard Nestle in 1898, was he published a Greek text in 1898 that was based off of Westcott and Hort's text, Tischendorf's text, and Weymouth's text, and he sifted through them and issued the Nestle text. And this Nestle text then becomes the basis for all modern translations. Irwin, his son, in 1927, continued that work. Kurt Aland, another individual, joined this team in 1952. And so the Nestle text then became the Nestle-Aland text. And today, that text is published, and in the year 2012, the 28th edition of that text, called the NA 28, was published in 2012. I have a copy of it right over there in that bag on the front row. Okay, so the NA 28 was published in 2012, and there's one more step, if you can bear with me. The United Bible Society, UBS, also publishes a book called The Greek New Testament. And really all it is an exact replica of the NA 28. There's a picture of it, the Greek New Testament, 5th edition, United Bible Society. There's a picture of one of the pages. There's the Greek text. Down there is that part of the page called the apparatus, where they list out variants that are down there, and you can find out exactly what manuscript they're in and everything. It's all right there. There's nothing hidden here. And all of the modern versions are based on this text. Now, I've told you all this information, and maybe I really need to cull this thing down and weed out all this detail and just get a basic broad outline, but that's what I've tried to do here. But the whole point here is that this text is the basis of the modern version. So again, I repeat, down here, the Textus Receptus, or the received text, was taken from a few late manuscripts. The King James Version and the New King James Version translate from that text. Then, up here, NA, Nestle-Aland, and the UBS text are based on these earlier manuscripts from centuries before this, and this is the basis for all the modern versions. Okay, now, I've said all of that to get to this one point. I've said everything I've said tonight to get you to this point, and that is, all of us have opened up our King James Bible, or our New King James Bible, and we're reading a verse, and then we open up to some translation like it could be the RSV, it could be the ASV, it could be the NASB, it could be the NIV, and you look over here, and the verse over here is longer than it is over here, or part of it's gone over here in one of these other translations. Why is that? Now, I know there are lots of tracts and books. I've seen tracts among our own brethren published that basically tar and feather the translators as some kind of nefarious critics of the Bible that simply want to take things out of the Word of God. And the reason, really, the real reason why these differences exist is because they're based on two different Greek texts. One is based on later manuscripts, the other is based on earlier manuscripts, and basically the trend that took place with the passing of centuries was that little things were actually crept in and added, that the older text is saying, look, we need to go farther back, we need to get farther back to the beginning, toward the beginning, and establish the text from earlier manuscripts than later ones. And that's the reason why all of the modern versions do this. Now, I'm going to close here with a reference to a passage in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 14. I was hurrying to do this before church, so I didn't get this completely done. I should have put the verse up here to show you what I'm talking about. But if you turn to Colossians 1 and verse 14 in the King James and New King James Version, you're going to see the phrase, through his blood, in that verse. But if you look at the NIV, if you look at the NASB, the ASV, the RV, the RSV, whatever, any modern translation, the phrase through his blood won't be there. Now, if you turn over to Ephesians chapter 7, all translations have that phrase in the exact same statement. So it's not that they're taking that statement away, because it's still there in Ephesians in all translations. But if you have a New King James, and this is one of the great things about the New King James, is the New King James tells you many of these variants like this. If you look in that center column of the New King James Version, it will say this. It will say, in you omits through his blood. The in there is the in on NA over here, and the U is the U of UBS. They're saying this Greek text omits those words, but of course the Textus Receptus does not in Colossians 1 and verse 14. But in fact, it does occur in Ephesians 1 and verse 7. So this kind of brings me down to the conclusion. We've been talking about Bible translations. We've been talking about translation philosophy. We've been talking about a lot of English Bible history down through the ages. We come now to the Greek text, and really the whole point in presenting this material here is to give us a true picture and reason why these differences appear between the KJV, NKJV, and the modern versions. It's simply because they're basing it on another Greek text, and that Greek text is collated from older manuscripts that do not have those particular phrases and expressions.